No. I'm the dinosaur. That's way back. You got me. You got me on. Everybody can hear me here? Good. When Chris asked me to teach on 1st and 2nd Kings, Novita and I had just got through studying those two books, so I thought, as much as I wanted to say, boy, my memory just not what it used to be, and I can't do it. And I thought that's more than coincidence. But after hearing our brother just a while ago, and I'm thinking, oh, I remember when I had a memory that I could pull up some of that stuff, but I can't anymore. And so I'm going to apologize to you up front. I used to pride myself on, if I had heard a phone number, it was there. Even now, my wife once in a while says, what's that high school phone number over at Fort Gibson? What's the middle school number? What's the grade school number? I could remember those, and they were just there. And I could do that a lot of things. And you know, in the last year, and I've told her a couple of times, I said, she'll ask me a question that I should know. And we talked about it. I said, I can't remember. I've lost it in the last year. Has that happened to any of y'all? Oh my gosh. And so what do? You just smile and say, hey, that's part of it. The Lord designed us this way. These bodies aren't expected to last forever, and they're not going to. So you smile and keep on trucking. The Book of Kings. You know, it's interesting when you go back and you study this, and there are so many things that you can learn, how God worked through the lives of the kings that would let him, and those who wouldn't paid the price. But so we're going to go for the next, through July and August, and try to cover it. We won't get to cover all of them, because when the Babylonian captivity took place, that's where it stopped. But prior to that, the northern tribes, there was 10 of them, and after Solomon, we know the first king that was chosen was Saul, and then David, and then Solomon, David's son. But at the end of Solomon's reign, the kingdom split. The northern tribes, there were 10 of them. The southern tribes, there was 2, Judah and Benjamin. And during that span, there were some 39 kings that were elected. There was 19 in the northern tribes. All of them were considered evil. Now, ain't that something? You go 0 and 19. Well, you go 0 and 19 around here and you get fired. And then the southern kingdom had 20 kings. 8 of them were good. What specified evil? In the eyes of God, it was one who worshiped idols. And these kings that were evil, classified evil, did that very thing. But the 8 good ones had a lot in common. Test my memory here now. Asa, Azariah, Amaziah, Hezekiah. See if you can get the ayahs right. You got half of it. Josiah, Joash, Jotham, and Jehoshaphat. You know how I learned the last two? Y'all remember, I'm going to date myself here. You watched Gabby Hayes? Remember Gabby? I'd always say, jumping Jehoshaphat. Well, I got a Jotham Jehoshaphat. Anyway, those are folks. We won't have time to study all of them during this study. Probably somewhere less than a dozen, I would say. Time permits, so I'll move on. As we've mentioned, those 39 kings that were selected, and only 8 were classified as good kings. We're going to find out that out of these kings, we're going to learn some good lessons and maybe find out some bad. In fact, next week when we get into Saul, we'll classify him as the good, the bad, and unfortunately the ugly. But we'll see some of his mistakes. We're going to locate scriptures from Samuel and the book of Chronicles. That'll help us in our study of this Kings. First and Second Kings are really a history of the kingdom from the time of Solomon till the time of the Babylonian exile. The author of it is Jeremiah, the prophet, with the exception of the last chapter. And we know that he couldn't have written it because he had been exiled into Egypt. And so someone else who had written that last chapter. At this point, I don't know if there's anybody that ever pinned that down, but that's the case. We're going to learn a lot about God through the study of kings, especially the kings of Judah. Priests and prophets played a role in the people's life and in dealing with the kings. Samuel was a very active player in this study we're going to have. A prophet, served also as a judge. They also called the prophets seers. People would come to want to see the seer. In fact, Saul did that himself, that we'll pick up on next week. You remember who Samuel's mother was? Turn your Bibles, if you would. We will look at a passage here in Samuel, first chapter. Let's look at verses 1 through 18. Elkanah and his wives. Now there was a certain man from Rabbanath-Zophim, from the hill country of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jehoram, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zub, and Ephraimite. If I butchered some of those, y'all help me later and we'll get those names right. He had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man would go up from the city yearly to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests to the Lord there. When the day came that Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and her daughters. But to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah. But the Lord had closed her womb. Her rival, however, would provoke her bitterly to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. It happened year after year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she would provoke her. So she wept and would not eat. Then Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, Why do you weep, and why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? I am not better to you. Am I not better than you than 10 sons? Then Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest, here's another one of the priests that we find had a hand in some of this. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorstep of the temple of the Lord. She, greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come onto his head. Now it came about, as she continued praying before the Lord, that Eli was watching her mouth. As for Hannah, she was speaking in her heart, only her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. Then Eli said to her, How long will you make yourself drunk? Put away your wine from you. But Hannah replied, No, my Lord, I'm a woman oppressed in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have poured out my soul before you. Do not consider your maidservant as a worthless woman, for I have spoken until now out of my great concern and provocation. Then Eli answered and said, Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your petition that you have asked of him. And she said, Let your maidservant find favor in your sight. So the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Through that request, God granted it, and she did have a child. She named him Samuel. When he was weaned off, she took him and dedicated him to the Lord, and he goes to be raised by the priest there in the temple. And when you look back at that and you realize this lady had not had children for so many years, and then she actually, I guess, makes a deal with the Lord, and he grants it. The good thing is, after that, she was able to have 5 more children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. She was blessed greatly by the Lord. So here comes Samuel into the picture, and he's just a boy, and he's having these dreams, and all of a sudden, Eli, who sort of looks after him, the priest, realizes that it's God talking to Samuel and granting him the wisdom to become a prophet. And so he does. Now, at that point in time, Samuel, as he is growing and has the wisdom that comes from the Lord, and indeed is a seer, that the Lord shares these things that he wants Samuel to be involved in. But now we want to go to 8th chapter of Samuel. This point in time, Samuel had been trying to tell the folks there was clamoring about needing a king. And Samuel kept reminding the people, you've got a king. God is your king. And of course, you have to understand where they're living, all the nations around them had kings. But for the most part, they were pagan nations. One thing I forgot to mention was when you're in power of being a prophet, there are certain expectations. These had to be godly men. But I found it really interesting that Eli had 2 sons. I think it was Hophni and Phinehas. They were bad guys. They were just bad guys. They had They slept with the women at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And I suppose that was maybe called back then some of the prostitutes, temple prostitutes. But they did that openly, and their dad, Eli, was reminding them, he said, I'm hearing all these bad reports on you guys, which he felt like was a reflection back to him, and I guess it is. No one wants to see their children not follow the Lord. But of all things, we find Samuel here, and later we read that he had 2 sons, and he had set them up when he was old. He'd set them up to be priests as well. And the Bible says that they were, or judges, and as they were in positions of power, they were dishonest, and they went for the money. And I guess if you had enough money and paid the pocket of the judge, you got a favorable report. Sound like some of the things we hear today, isn't it? But so you think about that, and you think, here's 2 godly men, but they raised a couple of sons that were so worldly. God actually called them worthless, these men these sons of Eli. Okay, so we get into this request about, we want a king. You could hear the rally cry of the people. They want a king. And chapter 8, 1 Samuel. And it came about when Samuel was old that he appointed his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah. They were judging in Beersheba. His sons, however, did not walk in the ways, but turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations. Well, you think about that. They had great confidence in Samuel. In fact, later on, Samuel goes on trial, puts himself on trial and says, if I have cheated anybody, you let me know that. And they realized he was a godly man, and he didn't, but his sons were quite different. And you think about, you see how what the elders said? He had placed these 2 sons were judges, but they knew his sons were crooked. And they realized, look, you're getting old, but we need a king, an earthly king. So that's where it started. And we see that these men, they give credit to Nathan. I mean, not Nathan, to Samuel, but they realize you're leaving a couple of crooks to judge us, and we want a king to judge us. But the thing was displeasing in the sight of God, and it came upon him mightily, so that he prophesied. I skipped something here. So Samuel said, verse 6, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, like all the deeds which they have done since the day that I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods. So are they doing so to you also. Now then, listen to their voice. However, God is being specific with Samuel about doing this. He said, however, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of the procedures of the king who will reign over them. They thought getting an earthly king was going to solve all their problems. But we're going to see after Samuel tells them here in verse 10. So Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. He said, this will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you. He's going to take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among the horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of fifties, and some to do his plowing and reap his harvest, and to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He'll also take your daughters for perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He'll take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He'll take a tenth of your seed and of your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. He'll also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He'll take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. Then you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. Nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, so that we may also be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. All the things that, as a parent, if you were told, this new king is going to take your best kids, your sons, your daughters, put them to work for him, you would think that you'd back up on that. But these people were dead set that a king was going to solve all their problems. God's ideal king. I want you to turn your Bibles to Deuteronomy 17. God's ideal king. He's going to put this, actually, Moses was instructed, and God, you don't think God can see ahead. You'll see this coming. Chapter 17 of Deuteronomy, beginning in verse 14. God has told Moses, when you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it, and you live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me. You shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your countrymen. You shall set as king over yourselves, and you will not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your countrymen. Okay, here's the only requirement. Here's the requirement of the people when they select the king. See, God could see in the future and knew good and well what the people were going to do. When they got to that point, he knew that there's going to be clamoring for a king. They didn't want him to be their king. They wanted an earthly king. So this is way back before the request was made that Samuel was dealing with. But here are the requirements. The first thing for the people is you're going to find somebody that God would choose. So that's a godly man. They're looking for that kind of man. And he's got to be what? A foreigner? He got to be one of you. He got to be one of the tribe, from the tribe. But look at the next 4 requirements. This falls on whoever's chosen. The king that you choose. 14 or 16. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. So the first requirement that he's putting on the king that is selected is, I don't know what it is about the multiple horses, because if they've got chariots, you got a need for horses. I assume that they breed them themselves without having to go back to Egypt. There was no way anybody was going to go back to Egypt according to the Lord. So this was a requirement on the king that would be chosen. Verse 17, here's another one. The king shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. Sort of a twofold requirement. Not multiple wives. Solomon failed that deal, didn't he? Yes, he did. He sure did. And as we study some of these kings, we're going to find where they fell short in these requirements. And don't fix for yourself much silver and gold. Hezekiah failed in that one. We'll find out. And unfortunately, he boasted too much about it. The Babylonians came and took it all away from him. We'll catch him down the road somewhere. 18. Now it shall come about when the king sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priest. In other words, no multiplying the horses, no multiple wives, not much silver or gold for yourself. And he had to recite this, and he had to write this on the scroll in front of the Levitical priests. They say if you write something down, you have more of a tendency to remember it. Well, they're going to make sure of that, because verse 19 says, it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by carefully observing all the words of this law and these statutes, so that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or the left, so that he and his sons may continue long in his kingdom in the midst of Israel. So he's written it out. He reads it every day. 3 things he can't do. So how do you go back and forget those things? If you don't read them or you ignore them. And we find that of these 39 kings that were selected to oversee the northern kingdom and Judah, that they failed in a lot of ways. In fact, it's refreshing when you find a king like Asa or Joash who tried to do it God's way. But even a good king, we'll find out, they're not perfect. They make some obvious mistakes. But you would think here, and God gave this to Moses, knowing down the road this is going to become an issue. My wonder myself is, when they started selecting those judges or those kings, were they required to write on the scroll these requirements? These are commandments. These are statutes that God puts in place to try to make those men successful. God doesn't want them to fail. Although when his selection of Saul, and what's the sad part about that is, and we'll see it in Scripture, he said, I regret I ever made Saul the king. That's sad. Anyway, we see what God's intention is. Oh, they're going to go ahead and want their king, and they don't want to listen to me. Well, here's some requirements that they need to remember to do. Don't get a foreigner. Get one of your own people, your own countrymen. And so, somewhere along the way, from back when this was put in motion in Deuteronomy to the book of Samuel, somebody forgot to pass that on, because we can see the devastation. And when the kings were bad, and remember what made the king evil. The definition was that he participated in idolatry. And the two things that Jeremiah the prophet was hitting on here and reminding him of, it was so bad that not just idolatry, but the immorality at that time among all the tribes must have been horrible. Well, for a couple of sons of Eli to openly do what they did, it would be, without a doubt, carefree attitude. So we see what the good ideal king was in the eyes of God. And we're going to have opportunity to find out how so many of them stumped their toe, didn't even get past first base, and were just a terrible. What's bad about this is, when you got a bad king, you know who suffers? The people. I mean, and you know, today there's so much graft and things that goes on in our civilization. And when you get a bad person in a particular office, there's results that trickle down. And we don't like it when it affects us. Two things I've found that will get people's attention. You take their freedom away, lock them up, man, that gets your attention. The second one is, you get in their pocketbook. When you get in that man's pocketbook, you get his attention. And we see things today with some of the laws that's being passed and what's happening that we don't like. So anyway, the next few weeks, next week we're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And Saul falls in all three of those. But you know, the way he starts out, God blesses him. Can you see Saul as being a prophet and prophesying? He did. He had it right to start with. But over a period of time, he just botched it. In the very beginning, he was very humble. He wasn't like the picture you think about Saul. He hid when they tried to elevate him to the kingship. God had to tell him, oh, he's hid. I can tell you where he's hid. Go find him. But he went from that humble being, the arrogance and things. Anyway, we'll do that next week. You got a couple of minutes here, I guess. So hopefully this will enlighten us more about 1st and 2nd Kings and what God's plan was to, okay, you want a king, here's the requirements. They didn't pass the test. Well, 8 of them did. Thank you.